Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about Moral Tribes by Joshua Greene. This book was written in 2013, published in 2013, and kind of outlines Joshua Greene's career up to that point, I think. Kind of outlines what ends up being his dual process model without explicitly stating the model in a visual form, but goes through a lot of evidence that he feels backs up his model, and then kind of builds up a philosophical understanding, a meta-morality. That's the point of his book. And so I'm going to kind of go through this book maybe over the span of 2 weeks or so. I'm going to split it up into 5 different videos based on his 5 different sections in his book. And so this section will be part 1, which is moral problems. So I'll be going through this first section, which is the first 3 chapters. So to start off, we'll be talking about this big old circle in the middle here. He starts the book off, and this is a recurring theme and model throughout the book, with the idea of a herding society. 4 herding societies, actually. There are the northern herders, who are kind of individualistic in how they treat herding their sheep. So each herder gets as many sheep as they can, basically. Very much, if we want to think of sheep as currency, I think that might even be easier to some extent. So very much a capitalistic society. We have the southern herders, who are much more communal. Everything's shared, and in the same way, it's kind of a communistic almost society within that group. There are the Easterners, who are all about equality, and so more of like a justice. If you're aware of Jonathan Haidt's view of justice, it's more everyone, at least as it's explained in The Righteous Mind, everyone gets what they deserve, and that's equality. Meanwhile, juxtaposed with equity, which is what the Western herders value, everyone gets the same amount based on, everyone gets the same amount of currency or sheep. And equality, everyone gets the amount of sheep that they should have based on their family size. So it's controlled by family size. And in the start of this kind of thought experiment, these 4 herders or herding groups are divided by a 4-way forest. And so basically, eventually, the forest disapparates, and all of a sudden, these 4 herding groups with their different values have to come together and work together to decide what the best values are and how they should go about raising their sheep. And this causes a lot of strife and a lot of conflict. And this is all a metaphor for how we exist as a society today. We have, especially as we become more and more international, and through things like the internet, obviously, and social media, and all kinds of things like that, the accessibility of information and of each other across the world is increasing at the speed of light, and it's already monumental today. And so we have things like religion, where people have different values based on where they live, based on what religion group they're a part of, who they believe in as a metaphysical being, and things like that. And that causes conflict because we have different values, and or at least we value the same things fundamentally, which I think is the argument that Joshua Greene would make, but they manifest themselves differently, and that causes conflict. That different manifestation that isn't necessarily something we can just get rid of, which I think manifestation kind of implies. And so first, I think we should define morality as Joshua Greene views it, which I'm currently, like I said in my introductory video, I'm currently rereading The Righteous Mind, and both Haidt and Greene view morality as something very similar, I think. Greene defines it as a set of psychological adaptations that allow otherwise selfish individuals to reap the benefits of cooperation. And I made sure to underline cooperation here because that's really the basis of it. In a footnote, Greene does take care to note that he doesn't explicitly say that this is a manifestation of social evolution, of group evolution, group level evolution, which I think is interesting because Jonathan Haidt seems like a big fan of Edward O. Wilson and group selection. But anyway, so kind of the way he outlines these first chapters is kind of taking a look at the individual and the mechanisms, the psychological mechanisms that make up the conflict between myself as an individual and my group. And eventually we get to a meta-morality because those same mechanisms that make us want to help our group as opposed to us also make us want to help our group as opposed to them, our out group, the people we don't identify with. And so first we'll talk about moral motions. There are a few that he really talks about, 6 in particular. That is concern for others, direct and indirect reciprocity, commitment to threats and promises, reparation, and assortment. And so kind of going through them, they're fairly basic, I would say, but a concern for others is like empathy, basically compassion, which interestingly, this summer I read Against Empathy by Paul Bloom, which was provocative, not completely convincing, or persuasive. But in that book, he outlines various different instances or circumstances where empathy can lead us wrong and emotion can lead us wrong as someone who is also striving for a rationalist ideal, as Greene is, as we'll see in these videos. But concern for others does, for the me versus us purpose, put others ahead of ourselves at times. So you can think of some situation where you have to risk your life for someone else, that maybe a family member, maybe a friend, maybe someone else who goes to your university or anything like that, which to varying degrees has power, but at a certain point, if someone is a complete stranger, you're less likely to help them. If someone is out of your group and is explicitly, you put that person's group against yours, you oppose each other's groups, then you're much less likely to help those people. Direct and indirect reciprocity. Talking about direct reciprocity, that's specifically when you are dealing with someone in negotiations, say, if someone helps you, you help them. And also with indirect reciprocity, if you help someone or someone helps you, you don't necessarily have to help them right now, but on down the line, you will help them. So there's kind of an expectation that even if you don't help, even if you do something good for someone else and they don't repay it right now, someone else, they'll repay it later just by being in the group dynamic and cooperating. Commitment to threats and promises. This one's really interesting. There's a video on YouTube that's a debate between Joshua Greene, Daniel Dennett, and Steven Pinker, all of Harvard, about free will. It's pretty easy to find. I bet you could just look up Joshua Greene and then look for it. But a lot of that discussion was about you could say punishing people even if there's no free will, you punish people to make sure that other people are aware that you're able to be punished for doing something that you deem wrong. And so with the commitment to threats and promises, the kind of idea is that you should be able to punish someone. You should be able to punish someone if they do something wrong, but you really try not to generally. But there's that power and that threat looming over that kind of coerces people into being good, because sometimes you need that kind of power. Then reparation, if someone does something wrong, they should be expected to do something right in the future. So we can think of reparations for slavery right now, which is a kind of ongoing debate, I would say, and maybe was especially popular a few years ago, or especially talked about. There are people who argue that the United States or families who own slaves should pay reparations and give money or other resources, other opportunities to families that they owned. And then there are others who argue against that, of course. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a debate. But in the same way, if someone in this herder community kills your sheep, then you would generally expect someone to pay up eventually, and if they do, that's a sign of cooperation. And then assortment. With assortment, it's all about belonging to a group, working together, and then cooperating for the sake of us versus the sake of everyone, especially them. Assortment is kind of defined as working together to find the optimal strategy for cooperation within a group. So that's it with moral emotions. And so then in his last chapter in this section, we get more into different mechanisms outside of emotion that promote cooperation, and just kind of, you could say, more narrative evidence. So one that is interesting that Joshua Greene did, one study, was giving participants a moral problem to answer and a certain amount of time to answer. And he found that as time increased, cooperative decision making decreased. So if you had to make a decision after seeing, say, an image for half a second, you'd be much more likely to make a cooperative judgment on how you should act, versus if you got to think for 20 seconds, then generally you would be more selfish. And there are various studies or you could say games that you could play to figure this out, like the public goods game and such. But to him and to some others, this game is, and this result is evidence that intuition generally favors cooperation. And so we'll talk a bit more about the almost dichotomous relationship between intuition and deliberate reasoning next video. But for now, it's interesting and important to point out that in the dual process model that Josh Greene created, it's kind of divided into intuition and deliberate reasoning. So intuition being Daniel Kahneman's system one, and then deliberate reasoning being system two. So intuition is quick, fast processes. Deliberate reasoning is controlled processes, effortful processes in terms of cognition. And so with this, it's evidence for intuitive judgments being more cooperative. And then so kind of getting more into the us versus them aspect as opposed to the me versus us. There are a few interesting studies. One concept is biased perception, which I find incredibly fascinating. Basically with this, some people, or if you are in a group, pretty much everyone believes that group to be better than someone not in your group. So there are studies cited in this book about when you are placed in a group with a bunch of strangers and told that you're in a group and then told to argue with another group. So you're all strangers, you're all just people who came to this experiment to participate, and then you're divided into random groups with no identifiable commonality. And you're not told that you have any identifiable commonality. You're just told you're in this group, now you're supposed to argue. You're automatically, in these studies, going to find your group's arguments more persuasive than the other groups, even if they're not as persuasive objectively. So one example is in a jury scenario where you're supposed to talk and debate about a specific case. If you're divided into one group that's told to argue for one side and divided into another group as opposed to the other group that's supposed to argue the other side, you're going to argue for that case more strongly. So if you're coming up with a case on a murder and you're meant to argue for that person being guilty, and you all as a group cooperate to make that argument, you're going to find that more convincing just because it's you and just because it's part of your group, as opposed to the actual reasoning of the evidence. And my understanding is that usually those studies are meant to be kind of not vague exactly, but easily interpretable for your side to a certain degree. It's complex enough that you can make a case for yourself. So one interesting study was that as scientific literacy in the political domain specifically, it was a researcher, I forget the name, was looking at the political divide between United States American progressives and conservatives, and kind of the prevailing notion before this study was that liberals or progressives were more scientifically literate than conservatives, specifically because I think global warming views differed so much. And so they ran the study, and basically what they found is that it wasn't the case that you could, because people were more scientifically literate in the first place, that didn't mean that they came to better reasoning, only that they came to better justifications for their group's reasoning. And so even though, the scientific literacy of the groups weren't different, so progressives weren't more literate than conservatives, but also even for individuals who were more literate, all they were doing to some extent, if they identified enough with their group, was providing a justification for their intuitive judgment that was stimulated by that group. And so then a final interesting one is honor versus harmony, which kind of in the United States is maybe more seen in the South, because there's a bit more honor culture in the South. And so one study that Joshua Greene did was have people, or maybe not Joshua Greene, someone, have people walk down a narrow hallway. And so the participants would walk down this hallway to the lab room, and then on the other side, a big Confederate, a big research member, basically, as in a big person as in size, would walk down the other way, and then they would calculate the length from the Confederate that the participant would stop at. And so people who identified more with an honor society, who were more Southern in this case, stopped closer to the Confederate than others, than Northerners. And so because The reason cited was because they live in an honor society, and honor is an important value more than harmony to some extent. They were less willing to kind of be made a fool of by stopping before the other person, and thereby being seen as timid and not prideful, or not as someone without pride. But Northerners, in this case, generally stop sooner, and in that way are more concerned with the harmony of the group in this study. And we'll see that maybe that's not always the case in terms of geographical divide. So that's pretty much the first section, moral problems, of Joshua Greene's Moral Tribes. And so I'd like to end off with a little conclusion. We are a species that prefers us to them, and we have adapted capacities to serve that preference. But to create a more peaceful world, we need to dissolve these boundaries, or at least bridge them. Doing so will require a deeper understanding of how we think, which is where we'll go next video. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next video.